because every time I do speak, which is this is the second time, since I always have to follow the master there. See, I did this when Pastor Rick was on vacation, and the week before, Pastor Dan spoke, and then this time when we said there'd be four of us to speak on this series on Philippians, I thought, man, maybe I can weave in somewhere up in through here, but no, what did I get? After Pastor Dan again. So we'll see what happens with that. But also, the series has been really good. Pastor Lee started out with talking to us about serving and bond servants. And then our youth pastor here, Pastor back here, he said, man, he took that to a new level, and how you serve and pouring out to others and use your gifts, kind of like mentoring people. And he had this nice demonstration up here. Pastor Richard did a great job. And then, of course, Pastor Dan last week. So now I want you to just listen to that. See, we had Pastor Lee. And we had Pastor Richard. And we had Pastor Dan. Now you got Tom. See. But out of that, as I was thinking about it, I thought, man, we could really put a good group together. We could call them the three pastors and me. So that would work out okay. I'd like that. But they did such a great job. And as we get ready for today, I entitled my talk this morning in Philippians chapter 4 to be peace and joy in all circumstances. Now, I want to remind you what Pastor Dan said last week, if you were here, that joy does not mean happiness. It can be happiness. It can lead to happiness. But joy is something that you have all of the time if you have Jesus in your heart. If you've accepted Jesus and He's in your heart, no matter what your circumstances might be, good, bad, ugly, whatever, you can still have joy and work your way through that in trusting in the Lord. So that's why I've taken this chapter and we'll speak about various things about joy and peace. So let's kind of recap a little bit. We know that we're talking about this church in Philippi. Philippi was a Roman, what I call, it's almost like a Roman fort, really, because we had the Roman military and those people who have settled there. And this Paul has come, and with Lydia, they've established this church. And, and the king of the time was Philip, and he was the father of Alexander the Great. But anyway, Paul comes and with Lydia to establish this church. And they get it established, and so this letter that we're looking at is the letter that Paul has written back to the church while he's in prison in Rome. And he'd been in prison earlier in Philippi. But I want to back up just a little bit with you, because I find Paul establishing a church in Philippi quite ironic. So go back with me, and let's say that we're all living in Philippi. And this Lydia has called a town hall meeting. And we're in this town hall meeting. And she says, I want you folks to really listen to this guy I brought with me, because he's got a story to tell. And I think it's really good, and it'll be good for us. And so Paul begins to talk. Now, in this town hall meeting, I'm an agitator. Okay? And I raise my hand and I say, hey, Paul, before you go any farther in what you're saying, aren't you a Roman citizen? Paul says, well, yeah, I was born in Tarsus, and Tarsus was a Roman colony, and by my birth, yes, I am a Roman citizen. Well, how in the world can you be preaching this? Because this guy, Jesus, he was a threat to us. All of our kings were worried about him. We've gone to wars about this stuff. And here you are trying to tell us we need to believe this? And oh, by the way, aren't you a Jew? Well, yeah, I've been circumcised and all that. You see. Well, weren't you high up in the church? Weren't you even kind of like someone who went out as a bounty hunter? And these very people who did believe what you're wanting us to believe, you persecuted, even had some of them put to death. And now you are telling us that we have to create this church here? I'm telling you, Paul, or whatever you're called, it's going to take a miracle for that to happen. Well, guess what? Long before Paul got there, a miracle did happen. You see, Paul was on his way to Damascus, and he had an encounter with Jesus, which changed his whole life. That encounter with Jesus allowed him to accept what Jesus was and who he was, and accepted the Holy Spirit into his heart. And so he changed the way he did things, and he tells us back in a book, another letter that he wrote, actually to the letter that Romans in chapter 12, he says, this is how my life has changed and how you should be able, all of us should live. We should be able to have joy and hope. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to have everything good and bad, because even in bad times, we can have the hope, and you can have joy in that. And when you're in those times, be patient. He says, be patient in affliction. But always take everything faithfully to God in prayer. So have that joy in your life for the hope. There will be times of affliction, but be patient, because God will work with you to get you through it. And you go to him faithfully in prayer. And so as we begin to take a look at what he says in Philippians chapter 4, the theme that we have been working on actually comes from chapter 1. And in chapter 1, verse 21, it basically says that for me to live is to be in Christ, but to die is to gain. Now remember, Paul's in prison. It's pretty hard times. And he's basically saying, and he kind of alluded to it earlier, he said, you know what? I wish I would die, because I would then be with Jesus again. I would be by his side and talking to him. But there's work to be done. But I have him in my life. And to have him in my life is to be with Christ. And then I've also added, because the book of Philippians is full of joy. And a verse comes out of chapter 4 called Rejoice in the Lord Always. And we'll take a look at that. The fourth chapter is actually broken down into three different parts, or actually four parts. First three verses, he's giving some instructions to the saints. And then he begins to give us instructions on how we should walk this walk once we've accepted Christ. Okay? How we should live our lives, the things that we should be able to do. And then the third part, he talks about the giving that the Philippians have done. They have given to him, and he refers to Epaphroditus, who brought him this last gift, and he shares with that. And then he closes with a prayer and a doxology. So let's begin to tackle. And it's interesting because I said, all right, man, I'm getting ready to get into chapter 4 here. And I opened the Bible to look at it, and the first word I saw was therefore. Now, the word therefore basically is like a stop sign. It's like, if you've been on a snowmobile, I used to love the snowmobile. And you got fresh packed snow and a wide path, and and you jump on that sled, and man, you just give it the thumb throttle, and you're flying, and you get it to top end about 75 or 80, and just as you get really rolling, you come up against a crossing path, and there's a stop sign there. That's kind of like, therefore, stop. You see, I actually wiped out a guy's tail one time and replaced his taillight, because he did that, and I was right behind him, and he stopped, and I didn't stop in time. But anyway, therefore, it says you got to, before you go forward, let's look back. And what he's referring to here was what Pastor Dan talked about last week. Right at the end of chapter 3, he is basically talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And he's saying, I am so happy that you have listened to that, and you know that Jesus has been resurrected, and we're waiting for him. And he gives them a title. He gives the people a title of Philippi, and it's a great title, and I'm hoping that I can earn that same title. And he says, you are all citizens of heaven. Because of your beliefs, you are the citizens of heaven. Now, because you are the citizens of heaven, and then he says that you're my beloved and longed for brethren, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord. Now, crown here doesn't mean that I'm wearing a crown like a king. I am not loyalty over you. I am not over you. But what it basically is the Greek word Stephanos, not diadema. It's the Greek word Stephanos. And that's kind of like, hey, guys, you've all bought in. We've done all of this together. We're a great team. We just won the World Series. That's the type of joy and the glory and the crown that he's talking about. You have really established this church, and you have done all things well and continue to stand fast in that. I am so happy that you have bought the word and you are living the word. That's the crown that he's talking about. But just like any place and any church and anything, there's a little bit of erosion going on. And we see in verse 2, he says, I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Now, Paul's not just saying, come on, gals, let's get this little spat over with. He's concerned. Implore means he's begging them to get their differences taken care of. I know you, because he goes on in the next verse, and he says, I know because you labored with me in establishing the church. And then he's asking others to help to get through this. He says, and I urge you also, true companion. Now, not sure who the true companion is. It could be Epaphroditus who brought the letter back. It could be Clement that he talks about in this same verse. It could even be Lydia. But he's saying, please, these women who labored with me in the gospel, and all of you fellow workers, let's get them through this little spat. Because all of you are in the book of life. Now, the book of life is mentioned in Revelations. In chapter 20 of Revelations, it says, those whose names are in the book of life will not be cast into the fiery lake. And Paul's saying, you guys are there. He just told them in chapter 3, you're the citizens of heaven. You're the citizens of heaven, and you're in the book of life. And I know you can help Lydia, and you can help, Euodia and Syntyche to get through this. And then he moves on to the next part when he starts talking about how we should walk the walk and giving us instructions. And he starts out with rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Be joyful in dealing with this situation. All of you saints. I like how Spurgeon puts it, and I like to read this to you. Because Spurgeon said, and speaking of this issue, he says, I'm glad that we do not know what the quarrel is about. He says, I'm usually thankful for ignorance on such subjects, but as a cure for disagreements, the Apostle Paul has said, rejoice in the Lord always. You know, people who are very happy, especially those who are happy in the Lord, are not apt either to give offense or to take offense. He said their minds are so sweetly occupied with higher things that they are not easily distracted by the little troubles which naturally arise among such imperfect creatures. Now, are we imperfect? We're all imperfect. Euodia was imperfect. Syntyche was imperfect. But he ends by saying, joy in the Lord is the cure for all discord. If you can approach those things in your life that are difficult, if it's relational, if it's just issues that come up in a church, if it's issues that come up in your life at work or wherever it might be, if you have joy in your heart, then that will cure all of the discord. Because being joyful, because you have hope. Remember what Paul said? Be joy and hope. Be patient in afflictions. But take it to God in prayer and be faithful in prayer. In verse 5, he goes on to say next, he says, let your gentleness be known to all men. because the Lord is at hand. The Lord will be with you. Now, gentleness here that Paul is speaking of is a word that relates to passion and compassion. Be patient with people. Be kind with people. Don't judge people. It's kind of like when they brought the lady who committed adultery to Jesus. And they were all sitting around and they said, we need to stone her to death because she has committed this terrible, terrible sin. What did Jesus do? He never even moved a mud. He just kind of drew in the sand. And then after a while, he looks up and he says, well, where'd all your accusers go? Where are they? I don't see them. And then he kindly and gently spoke to her and told her to go live your life as you know how you should live your life. In more modern day terms, many of you might know or may not know, but my wife Sarah has a real passion for the Native American people. And that got us to, I followed her because she was a school teacher forever, and so the only time we could really vacation for many years was in the summertime. And she ended up going on a mission trip, and I tagged along. And we went to, back in 2001, we went to Fort Peck, Montana. We got to Fort Peck, Montana. Temperature on the bank was 114 degrees. And that whole week we're there, it never got below 105. Now, she stayed the second week when kids come to help repair houses and stuff, and luckily the temperatures went down below 100 for those weeks. But the whole week that I was there with her, it was never got below 105. And our job at that first week was to go to each of the residents' homes. Okay? Go to each of the residents' home, talk to them, make them aware of what was going to be happening the next week, and then to make sure the materials had been delivered and we knew where they were to do the project on the house. So first Monday morning, going to the first house. I'm scared to death. Okay, so, I'm trembling. House, it's a little trailer, sits back up on the hill about a half a mile from the main road. So here we go. No trees around, nothing. 105, 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm saying, well, we got to knock on the door, and I'm hoping that no one's home because that way I don't have to deal with this. You know what? I can just leave. I feel good. So about the third knock, the door opens. This little Native American lady, had to be in her 80s. And we tell her who we are, and she invites us in. First thing out of my mouth, I say, how are you doing in this heat? Well, she looked right at me, stared at me, and she said, son, I'm an Indian. Okay, foot and mouth. This is going to be a good visit, you know? So we go over and we sit down at the table, and I start talking about what's going to happen the next week. And all of a sudden, she's gone. I have no idea where she went. I looked at Sarah, and she kind of looked at me, and I thought, what have I done this time? You know, I thought I was following the script here, you know. Well, she went somewhere, and she came back into the house. We didn't see her. And she walked up, as we're sitting at this table, and she walked up behind Sarah, and she takes her hair, and she lifts it, and she lays this cold cloth on Sarah's neck. And she says, sweetheart, this will help cool you down. You know, I'm sitting there thinking, man, we're supposed to be serving her. And she's serving us in such a kind and such a gentle way. And as it says, be gentle to all people. We're strangers. We're walking in off the street. She's never seen us before. But boy, was she gentle. And was she kind. That's what Paul's talking about in verse 5. And then he says in verse 6, he says, be anxious about nothing. Now, anxious and eager, we confuse that word sometimes. We'll say, man, I'm anxious to go play the game. Well, no, you might be eager to go play the game. You're really wanting to do that. Anxious is worry. And Paul says, don't worry about things. Don't be anxious about anything. But He says in verse 6, he says, I want you to take it to God in prayer always and with supplication. Now, supplication means it's okay to ask God for stuff. As a matter of fact, a little bit farther in that verse, it basically says, take everything and explain to God what you really want. It's okay to do that. Pastor Dan preached a sermon on that one Sunday some time back. See, God knows our heart, God knows our mind, but sometimes He wants us in the game. So it's okay to ask Him. When you pray, say, man, it's specific. This is what I really need, God. This is what I would like to do. But when you do it, it also says do it with thanksgiving. Always give God the thanks for what He's about to do in your life. To give you that patience, to give you that joy, to give you the things that you need to get through whatever you're getting through. And then verse 7, which is my favorite verse in this whole chapter. And verse 7 says, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. The Bible speaks of peace in a number of aspects. As a matter of fact, there's 3 different aspects of peace. First aspect is the peace from God. The peace from God is a gift. It comes with God's grace. It's free. And when you accept God's grace, that peace will enter your heart. And along with that peace comes that joy. But it is twofold. God is giving, but you have to accept it. Accept that free gift. And once you have the peace from God, then you'll have peace with God. Now you can have this relationship with Him. And when you go to prayer and you talk to Him and you listen to Him, it's with that peace that you now have with Him because you've accepted His gift. But the peace that Paul refers to here in Philippians, verse 7, is the third peace, which is the peace of God. It's the peace that we don't understand. We can't understand it. Paul basically says it's beyond understanding. It surpasses all of that. But it has a purpose. And that purpose says that the peace of God, which surpasses understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus. It protects your heart. It keeps that heart in a joyful state. It protects your mind to do and to think what you should be thinking. And then he goes into verse 8 and he starts talking about all of these neat things. And they're all good things. He talks about purity. He talks about loveliness. And he talks about those things that could bring joy in our life. He says, with those things, that's what I want you to meditate on. Yeah, there's other stuff in your life. There's all the bad things, because we have our ups and we have our downs and everything else. But when you go to meditate on the good things. Because that's what will pull you through. Because if you meditate on the bad things, you just keep going down that swell. Meditate on those things that are good in your life. And then Paul says, hopefully I have shown that to you in the way that I've lived, in the way that you've seen me do things, in the way the things that you've heard me say. Basically, he's saying, if I've done it right, you should be able to just duplicate me. That's kind of what he's saying. And then we get into the third part. And the third part is a lot of verses, but it speaks to the gift that the Philippians have sent to Paul. And they have done it before. This letter is thankful for, a second time that they've sent him gifts. And he said, I know there's probably other times you would have sent them, but the opportunity wasn't there. But anytime that opportunity has been grasped, you have sent it to me. And you've done it again. Paul's in prison in Rome, and, it's not 3 meals a day. And as Richard pointed out, it's not 3 meals a day. It's not where you can take a couple hours out and do exercise out. And, no, you are chained. And anything that you get, you have to be able to provide yourself. And so this gift is something that really helped Paul. And Paul said, you know, even when I was establishing other churches, no one really took time to do that for me, but you did. When I was in Thessalonica, you sent me to help me to get through that. And now you're doing it again. And he says, it's not that I really need it, basically, because I have Jesus and I have joy and I have those things to get me through it. But boy, is it helpful. I like the way he kind of summed it up, because he basically said, you know, it's that sweet aroma. It's kind of what it is. He says it's just like the sweet aroma of giving like in the Old Testament, of the sacrifices that they gave, of their best lamb and of their best whatever. That's what Paul compares it to. That's what it means to me. As that sacrifice meant to God, that's what it means to me, this gift that you've given me. But then it closes. And I love the way he closed it. He closed it in prayer, and then he said, I want you to greet every saint in Christ Jesus. The brethren who are with me greet you, including those of Caesar's house. You know, those guards that were all around him. You know, they had listened to him. They had seen his ways and seen everything Paul's gone through and how he could still be joyful. They've seen it. But then he says, and the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. What a gift. What a gift. The grace of Jesus. And with that grace comes that peace from God. That gift of peace. And with that grace, and when we accept that peace, then we can have that peace with God. All of our dealings in our lives. Because he's there. He's in our heart. You've accepted it. But most importantly, you have the peace of God. The one that we can't understand. We'll have the peace of God with us always.